What do you like? Tell me what you like.
There's value in that because it almost gives the brain like a vacation, right?
Holistic health is completely underappreciated, but so critical. Eating whole foods, and the key is just to find something that you really enjoy.
Welcome to the NAMP Nourishing You Podcast. I'm Kristen Burkett.
And I'm Diana Wally. We're your hosts for NAMP's podcast dedicated to connecting holistic health enthusiasts with each other to share practical information from the holistic wellness space for enhanced vitality.
Diana and I are master nutrition therapists, board certified in holistic nutrition with private practices and an online joint venture that supports clients and practitioners as they strive to reach their full potential. We're honored to be hosting this podcast for NAMP and connecting our listeners with the latest in holistic wellness.
And if you enjoyed today's show, help us out by commenting below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel to help us spread the word.
This episode of the Nourishing You podcast is brought to you by Energy Bits.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Nourishing You podcast. It's really an honor to talk with Dr. Jill Christa today about mold and mycotoxins, a subject we all need to be more aware of. Dr. Jill Christa is a pioneering naturopathic doctor, best-selling author, devoted educator, and creative innovator. Her superpower is to make complex medical concepts simple and digestible for the average person. Dr. Jill's passion is to elevate the well-being of the planet via the well-being of her inhabitants. Her books, memberships, and online courses for practitioners and individuals support those wanting concrete steps to conquer health challenges. Dr. Jill focuses on conditions that cause injury to the brain and nervous system, including mold, PANDAS and PANDAS, Lyme disease, and concussion. As we welcome you to the show, Dr. Jill, I want to personally thank you as your resources have been invaluable to me as a practitioner. And thanks for being with us today to dig into this topic.
You. Oops, was I muted?
Yeah.
Okay. It's an honor to join you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. We're super excited for this conversation, Dr. Jill. Your work focuses on some really fascinating and I think underappreciated aspects of well-being. And I know we're going to talk about mold today. And I've heard you speak in different interviews about how so many common health issues can be associated with mold exposure. And it was really surprising to me. And I'm excited to get to that later in the conversation. But first, we want to get to know you a little better. So can you talk to us about your backstory and what propelled you into the work that you do today?
Sure. Well, I was working with Lyme patients because I'm in southern Wisconsin and didn't really know the full extent of what Lyme disease can do to a body. So I became trained as a Lyme literate doctor. And it is amazing when you find and treat the cause with something, you can actually when you identify the cause and you understand how complex it is and you apply the treatment, people get better. It's amazing. Just like with nutrition, right? It's like, oh, your body is trying to run without this critical nutrient. Let's get the nutrients settled and then the body works better. And in one of those patients, I had some chronic Lyme patients that even though we were doing all the right treatment, they still weren't getting better. So it's like, this isn't just Lyme. And in one of those patients in that crew, they found toxic black mold in his home. And it was just this moment of like, I wonder if that's why his gut is a mess. He's got chronic pelvic pain, chronic ear ringing, anxiety to beat the band. He gets more anxious from anti-anxiety drugs than not taking them, can't sleep, just all of these things that were breaking. And he was getting cancer diagnoses, skin cancer, all this kind of stuff. It's just like, I wonder if this is mold. So I went into the research and I found a ton of animal research on mold mycotoxins. So I knew mold is an allergy problem. And then I was familiar enough through naturopathic school, we're trained in environmental medicine, that I knew it could do some wonky neurological stuff if it was the bad black mold, that it could look like MS or something like that. And that's pretty much all I really understood until I started digging into the research. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is mold. This is so much mold that this is probably mold for all these other chronic Lyme patients. And sure enough, in almost all of them, they had either a current or a past exposure to mold. And it was just one of those things of like, I've been missing it. And if I have been missing it, I'm sure a lot of my colleagues are missing it as well. So I started creating a course of what I was seeing work so that I could share, speak at medical conferences or whatever. And at the same time, I was living we had just moved into a new house. It was a relatively new build, and it was full of mold. And that's when I was like, okay, I missed mold in my patients, and then I missed mold in my own home because I had a presumption, which was it was a new house.
Yeah. What? Tell us about that. How can it? Because I would never think a new house would have mold.
Yes, because there were errors in the building, in the build process. We're seeing mold go in brand new houses because they're building. People are starting to think of like weather as something we just treat the boards and we can just leave them in the dirt. That is a mold factory waiting to happen. So I'm watching brand new homes go up in my own neighborhood where they're leaving lumber sitting in dirt in a rainstorm. And I'm talking to the builder. I'm like, this is going to be a nightmare, a health nightmare for these people. And he's like, no, it's treated. It's okay. It's treated wood. Well, the building standard is supposed to keep it, off the dirt and then wrapped in tarp with some breathability on the side so that it can breathe, but it's not getting soaked and saturated. So the way we're building our buildings is a problem. And we now also have horizontal spaces that could never be dusted. Have you ever been bad about dusting your house?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, right. I don't know anyone that can't say yes to that. You see what happens in a very short amount of time, how it builds up. Well, now think about your air ducts. This is all horizontal space that we can't dust. And so it builds up in that same space. And in a higher, drier area like Colorado, it's less humidity floating through the air, but all of us live in pretty much the same indoor environment. And we're building uber tight houses that don't breathe. We are off-gassing humidity with our expiration and that kind of thing, our sweating and all those. And so, it's kind of like when people say, well, I live in the desert, so we can't have mold. Like, well, depends on what that lumber was exposed to before it got to you. Is the drywall moldy before it even goes into your house? And then are you managing indoor humidity? And the toxic part of mold doesn't have a scent at all. There's no odor. And that's what duped me. And that was my big thing of like, I got to get the word out, because I didn't know we had mold. It was one of those like drip, 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 plumbing errors, roofing errors, the whole thing. And we were the hangout house. So we had, kids come after sports and run through 6 kids in the shower. So I think we just kind of overwhelmed the saturated, the material, and all of a sudden it started raining in my kitchen from the bathroom above while someone was showering. And I was just like, I got a soup kettle and set it under the water. And it was just this moment of like, oh my gosh, we have a water problem. And oh no, I know this is going to be a mold problem. And sure enough, it was all 3 floors, second floor, middle floor, and basement were full of mold. And there was no smell. There was no musty, when I told a friend, she's like, your house? No way. And I'm like, yep, that's the tricky thing about mold. And so that's when I decided to write a book. I was not planning to be an author or anything like that, but I just thought, okay, I knew who to call for my inspector because I'd been working with all these other patients. Who's the inspector I need? Which remediator did I want to work with? What things did we need to do nutritionally, supplementally, treatment-wise? We needed some pharmaceuticals because my kids have some pre-existing health issues. And it was just like, I knew the steps. And I thought, everybody can do this. This is stuff that's within everyone's hands, mostly, except for the pharmaceutical stuff. And I just felt really duty bound to write the book to get the word out and just start getting on podcasts. So thank you. Because it is my mission now to be having people be aware how sneaky it can be and how it's more than an old building problem. It's just, it can be in any building problem, and that's terrifying.
So did you end up having symptoms from that, or you just knew that you had an issue, so you knew it needed to be treated just because?
Well, that's the sneaky thing about mold. I was having what I was chalking up as perimenopausal symptoms. And I was like, well, this is a little early, I was 40. But it will accentuate whatever your tendency is. So if you have kind of a tricky gut, it'll just make it more tricky. If you kind of have some food sensitivities, it'll make that a little more exaggerated. If you can tend toward migraine, it'll make sure that you have migraines more often than if you were, managing everything. For my kids, they were going into puberty. And so I thought, well, maybe that's why their autoimmune disease is flaring, is the hormone changes and, all of this stuff, or they weren't going into puberty, they were in it. But yeah, there are many, many things that we wrote off as something else. We'd also just had a major grief in our family. So, brain fog, insomnia, that can kind of happen with grief. And so there's all of this stuff that you can just write off. And that's the thing, is like, when I look back, mold really does a Jedi mind trick where I didn't realize how sick I was either, because I had so much brain fog and fatigue. But when you get to a point where you're a 40-year-old healthy person who goes for outdoor walks and exercise every day and eats great, and I need a nap every day, that's something's wrong there. Like that. There were definite signs, but when it's happening to you, even when you're the doctor who knows better, you can miss all that. Yeah.
Wow. Well, gosh, it's a shame that you had to go through that yourself, especially in a new house.
I know.
That's really frustrating. But I guess, there's always like the shining light at the end. Like, look what you've been able to bring to the world because of it. And
Right.
So many people are learning more about this now that never would have had an idea. So we are grateful for that. The topic of mold and mycotoxins in particular is one of those most people don't even want to think about. And I think even our general holistic practitioner community is a little bit nervous about it, and probably for different reasons. It can be very disruptive for people's lives, and no one wants to open that can of worms for somebody.
Right.
Also, there's just a lot of education that you need to be able to provide to the individual for them to even be accepting of it as a possibility. So there's a lot of work that goes in, and then training to be able to deal with it if you can bring that up with a patient or a client. So there's a lot wrapped around here. So we'd really love to spend some time in this episode getting into some of these basics. And so could you maybe take some time to explain to us the difference between mold and mycotoxins, number one? You've already talked a little bit about where exposure can happen, but maybe go into that a little bit more. And then why does it affect people so differently?
Yeah, great question. So the how does mold make us sick? I think it's helpful if we kind of understand the mechanisms or the parts about mold that are making people sick. And that I kind of think of it as there's the mold spore and fragments when the spore dies and breaks up. And so those are the things we're going to see on like the CDC website of what is mold illness. I kind of think of it as they're describing spore illness. So that's going to be allergies, sinusitis, runny nose, hay fever, those kinds of things. And then sensitive lungs and all the way to the extreme of asthma. So that's spores and spore fragments. So the parts of the spores that when it's broken up, there's so much more than that. And that's the part that I'm really trying to bring to the fore, because in my patient population who have mold-related illness, the spore part is only about 10% of the symptoms, 10 to 15 depends, because the spores can also induce a lot of mast cells, which can create a whole host of different symptoms. Now there's also the chemicals of mold. So if mold is able to live and metabolize, it can go into a dormant state where it's really allergenic, but it's not growing. That still needs to be removed from a house because all it needs is humidity over 50% to start to grow again. So if you have mold that's growing, it's going to be off-gassing these chemicals that are, I kind of jokingly call them mold farts, because they're just like metabolizing and just off-gassing. And so these are really, their mold farts are deadly farts. They're silent but deadly. They are things like alcohols, aldehydes. So someone who's sensitive to like the new smell is formaldehyde. If someone is getting more and more and more sensitive to that, I'm like, I wonder if they're exposed to mold and they just don't realize it because their cup is getting full of the mold aldehyde and they can't handle the other kinds of chemical aldehydes. And then there's some chemicals that come off. One is called mycophenolic acid. And this is a particular chemical that we use in medicine. It is such a potent immune suppressant that we use it in medicine IV to make sure that someone doesn't reject a new organ if they've had an organ transplant. And you can be breathing breathing air in your house and be getting this powerful chemical through your lungs into your bloodstream. And we can see that has kind of an antibacterial, like someone's been on an antibiotic. That's how they'll look. And you're like, this is so weird. You keep getting candida overgrowth and we're doing all the right things, the right diet, the right anti-candida stuff, but it's almost like you've been taking antibiotics. And that might be because they're actually breathing it in a moldy space. So we have mold spores, spore fragments, chemicals or mold parts. And then there's a fourth thing that mold can make that is a mycotoxin. So not all the chemicals are mycotoxins. And that only matters really to doctors because there's different ways to detoxify those kinds of things. But mycotoxins are made on purpose by mold to harm another living thing. So in a moldy building, you're also going to have bacteria because, and I write about it in my book, when we tested a board that looked super moldy. And I was like, oh, let's find out what, the remediators knew me. So they would always come like, put your white suit on, lady, where you're going to want to see this. And so I was testing all the different ways that you could test because I'm trying to learn. And it was really moldy looking. And everyone's like, oh, that's definitely going to be black mold. Sent it in for testing and it had no mold on it at all. And I called the inspector. I'm like, what? Should we send it again? Because I think we missed something. And she said, let's test it for bacteria. And it was loaded with bacteria. And so there's mold and there's bacteria that can grow in a damp environment. And the bacteria will emit some toxins as well that we are really familiar with in the gut world. We call them endotoxins. So, and those can mess up a gut and those can also irritate the lungs. So we've got mold spores, spore fragments, chemicals, mycotoxins, bacteria, and bacterial endotoxins that can all be happening in this damp building. So you would ask, like, where are we going to find it? Typically, it's going to be places where there's water, below water, because water goes this way. But it doesn't always go this way. Like in our situation in our house, the area of it was terrible. They probably should have, that builder shouldn't be building anymore. The plumber had burned through a drain pipe underneath the shower when he was welding the copper pipes. And it just would only drip when someone was in the shower and only when it would get a certain temperature. But that then would go to a subfloor that then was a plank, and it would go to the lower part of the plank. So we were looking at the ceiling, where the water was coming down was about 6 feet away from where it was actually coming down. So it can be a little tricky, but just remember water goes this way. So if someone is trying to test for mold or you're looking for signs of water, look at the bottom of things. So you can see things like underneath sinks. If there's that little rippling of the particle board, then that's problematic because that can be soaking enough and then trap that humidity in the space below. So you want to look under sinks, around toilets, around showers. If there's not really good caulk between like a shower insert and the tile, if there's a little crack there, that needs to be caulked because even a little bit of moisture is continuously going in there. If you take a shower every day, that can be a place where mold will settle in and be very happy. So maintaining all of those things, like every rainstorm, right after we had mold, I mean, I was pathological to make sure like our drain spouts were working, and it had become all of a sudden something that I was like, I'm now going to be the crazy person, but actually it's not crazy at all. It's good maintenance. Like checking that out when the seasons change and you're having all of the snow melt on your, when you're in a winter area, check to make sure things are draining appropriately off of your roof. And, just all those little things, watching ceilings, if there's any water staining, paint bubbling, rusting, all of that is just little signs of like, that shouldn't be happening. So I think we need to do some investigation or maintenance. It might be something where you just need to add some caulk. But yeah, those are the common ones. I would say our roof and then, underneath a sink or between a shower, if somebody's not being really good about drying off afterwards or managing humidity. It can also be basements. Basements are a real problematic place, and crawl spaces. Crawl spaces are going to have more bacteria than mold typically, at least in my patient base. And they really need to be managed, from a humidity standpoint, from a cross-contamination standpoint. Yeah. So there's lots of things. I just scared everybody.
Yeah, I'm going to steal your word of terrifying.
Yeah.
I know we're gonna talk about some happy things later.
Yes.
So we talked about areas in the home. What about different areas of the country? Because someone might be listening that lives in Arizona and thinking, "Oh, I live in the desert. There's no worries about mold." I think that's a common misconception.
Mhm.
I heard you on another interview talking about Hawaii, how they have a ton of mold. We were there over Christmas in an Airbnb. I'm like, I'm sure I was breathing in mold. But yeah, talk to us about, is there any sort of safe place? Is one place better than the other or worse than the other? What can you share about that?
I think there are naturally going to be some areas that are more damp and humid, and it's harder to dry out our inner air. We should be building differently based on those criteria, but we don't. We build the same old structures no matter what the terrain is and no matter what the humidity is, and that's problematic. So you take that tendency to think that, every climate is going to be exactly the same. We can put the same envelope up. And also the fact that we now are all about energy, trying to be energy stars.
Yes.
And that is now created uber tight houses with, if you have ductwork, you have horizontal spaces that can't be dusted. We build right through rainstorms. We build, there's no like builder's season anymore. They're just like building right through. So I think that the fact that humans like to live at a certain temperature and humidity, the indoor molds that we find are that kind as well. And what was fascinating in our own house, because I was, like you said, is probably the right person to have this happen to, because I tested everything. And I didn't believe when I was told, oh, no, mold can't grow there. I'm like, I don't feel good right here though. And we were having trouble in my kitchen, which was where the water came into the kitchen. And I was like, I wonder how many times this has happened that no one really noticed it was happening. And I just don't feel good here on this tile. And I was told over and over again, grout can't grow mold. Don't worry about it, whatever. And it's like, well, I had this big, moment with myself, like, who am I going to trust? Am I going to trust myself and my inner knowing, or am I going to trust the experts? And that would be my biggest message for everybody, is trust your inner knowing. Don't get talked out of it. Like, you're already talking yourself out of it enough. All it takes is that one other voice to go, no, it's probably nothing. It's so easy then, because you want it to not be a thing, to say, yeah, you're probably right. I'm probably just imagining it. And I want to say, no. That's mold's mind trick. So I trusted myself. We removed the tile. I had him test the grout. And there was 2 types of toxic desert mold growing in my kitchen. So molds that make people sick in Arizona.
In Wisconsin?
In Wisconsin.
Wow.
So it was because it was a dry grout sand, just like it would be in an Arizona thing. So I think, now that I've written a book and I have courses and things, I hear from people all over the globe, and people saying, thank you. Everyone here thinks mold can't grow here. And it's not about the here, it's about the indoor space. That's what's common about all of it.
Yeah. And the indoor space in Arizona is not the temperature that's outside in a Phoenix summer. Yeah. It's very different. Yeah.
You put a bunch
and
of
different humidity level too.
Right.
Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. AC, and you get all that running, and yeah.
So, I have family members, friends say, well, we've had that drip under the sink for 40 years. We're fine. Nobody's sick from it. Why do some people seem to be so much more sensitive than others when they're exposed to any of the 5 things that you mentioned that could be coming from these molds?
Yeah, there's a lot of it is more the rule than the exception, that everybody responds a little differently to the same exposure. And that has to do with a lot of different factors. That can be genetic, that can be their nutritional status. We see people that are very low in the omega-3s tend to take on the toxin more. than people who have sufficient omega-3s. People who are low in glutathione. So some of those foods that are going to be the more Brassicaceae family, so the broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprout, kale, people that aren't getting enough of that Brassicaceae family, the sulforaphanes, the glutathione, the stinky food, like eggs, garlic, all the things that stink. If you're not sufficient in that, you're not clearing out those toxins. Some people are just masters. They actually have a turned up liver detoxification system. And some people have a genetic thing that their detoxification systems are turned down. And so they're not able to clear them as quickly. So they're going to take on the toxin burden a lot faster than somebody who is a good detoxifier and can just kind of clear those things out. So nutritional status, genetics, where are they in relation to the exposure? So if it's in the master bathroom and the parents are sick, but the kids are fine because they're on the other side of the house, or maybe they're upstairs. What kind of mold are they exposed to? Is it going to be a mold that affects brain function, or is it a mold that maybe affects immunity? So they might express that a little bit differently. In most cases, if there are mycotoxins, remember the mycotoxins are made on purpose to defend a territory. That means there's other mold in that environment. So usually if there's a mycotoxin, there's competition. And also if they've had a previous exposure. One of the things that was a big aha for me is that we can actually become the moldy building. So we can actually take on the biofilm and the microbial infection of a house into our sinus and lung and gut passages. And then you are in the moldy building wherever you go. And that's so common. As I was working with mold sick patients, I wasn't treating the nose unless they had sinus symptoms. And so if they were really significantly sinusy, okay, we'll treat that, with some sinus treatment. And I was just treating the fungal burden systemically. We call them whole body antifungals. And when I read Dr. Brewer's study, this was my big they had tested healthy people, healthy controls against sick people who had been made sick from a damp building. And the sick people had chronic fatigue. So they were sick and impaired on a daily basis. It wasn't just once in a while they had some hormone changes or whatever. It was this chronic fatigue syndrome. So they tested them on their sinuses. I think they even did brain biopsy, lung, guts. They were doing biopsies of all of these areas. What they found is, lo and behold, we all have fungus in our sinuses. We all have the mold spores there because we're outside, we're breathing them, that's just part of our respiratory passages. And the difference is the sick people, they had mycotoxins in those washings. The healthy people did not, which means there was something fundamentally changed in the microbiome of their sinuses and probably of their oral cavity, probably of their gut, probably of their lungs. We're seeing a lot of lung microbiome studies now too. And that something has fundamentally changed, where it went from being a commensal microbiome to going through a continuum of a kind of sick microbiome with more pathogenic species and less beneficial, to now it's competing with each other, to now it's defending itself. And now the immune system is so depleted, those mold spores, doing what mold spores do naturally, start to say, hey, I kind of like this environment. I don't have as much competition in here, but I'm going to make sure I don't have competition. I'm going to start making mycotoxins. And it's profound. And we added the intranasal antifungals. I had patients that were getting better like this, and all of a sudden we added I was like, oh, I've been missing this. And they just went, whoop, they got better so much faster. And I think now I'm really impatient. Now I'm like, everybody on it. I was treated, because why mess around? These things can soak into your brain and affect brain function. And, Dr. Bredesen is talking about how Alzheimer's type 3 is mold exposure. So it is a big deal. It's so much more than just an aesthetic, icky thing that you can paint over. And by the way, painting over it doesn't work. Because all those chemicals that I was talking about, they're nanoparticle size. Mycotoxins are nanoparticles. So you can have mold behind everything, which was the case in our home. It was behind walls. It was under drywall, under tile, but the toxins were able to move into the indoor air and we were breathing them. And that's why we didn't smell it. When you get the mold gets exposed to air, that's when we start smelling the odors, the aldehydes and alcohols. Those are the stinky, musty, damp smells. But mycotoxins are ultra small nanoparticles, and they'll just move right through. Someone opens the door real fast in the front door, it just pulls it into the envelope of the space.
Wow.
Little buggers.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, how do you know? Because everybody's expressing differently, right? So that's why I created a questionnaire for my clinical confidence, because I was like, okay, how am I going to tell the difference between a Lyme patient with chronic Lyme and a mold patient with mold exposure? There's got to be a way to get to this question faster so we can get to the real treatment faster.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, the myriad health issues that can be tied to mold exposure. Yeah, this is perfect segue.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. And if anyone wants the questionnaire, it's on my website, so you can have it. We have it the most updated version. We just went through an update where we tightened it up a little bit because Dr. Neil Nathan and I are working on a study. We just got funding through the Change the Air Foundation to scientifically validate this questionnaire so that we can find out, is this questionnaire helpful in figuring out if it's mold? Because that's free. That's something that someone can just do a quick check. And then if they do think it's a problem, if the score, if we find out it's valid, I have used it for, 14, 15 years. I think I did this. I've used it for a long time. So for me, I find it very valid. But again, I have a patient base that's attracted to how I do things. So we're trying to figure out, is it catching, I don't think there is a garden variety mold, but the average mold sick person. And the reason why I had to create a questionnaire is because the symptoms are multisystemic. So any system in the body, and it can create any symptom, almost any symptom. However, there are kind of common clusters, and we can just go top down, would be brain fog, headaches. If you think about how your brain works, if you've had any alcohol, well, if you're breathing alcohol air, you're going to have kind of that buzzed brain fog thing. A lot of visual symptoms. People have visual changes. It'll be like your eyes are aging too fast, but then you get glasses or contacts, and then 2 weeks later, you're like, they don't seem to be working, and eye floaters and all of these things. So a lot of vision gets hit really hard. And the military is on top of this. They use something called a visual contrast sensitivity test. And Dr. Shoemaker was one of the first ones to use this for mold illness, realizing that it's a biotoxin illness. I'm not Shoemaker trained, but I just think it's a brilliant application of this. It's like, well, if the military is using it, that's been tested, so we can test that that's also something you can use in conjunction with the questionnaire. So if we get,
and that's relatively inexpensive too to do.
Yeah.
It's just an online visual test. It's
right. Yeah. I think I like vcstest.com. It's about $15 to do one, but you can get an annual. So if you do know it's mold, and you're trying to test, like, is our remediation working? If your insurance is putting you into a space and you want to make sure you're not sicker in that space, you can, test your visual contrast sensitivity and kind of be knowing like, okay, yeah, actually, I do feel worse in this space. They need to move me to another place because that one maybe had mold too. So if we work down, the eyes, lots of skin changes, you can see whatever your tendency is. If it's to get acne, it can get worse. If it's to have aging and wrinkling and age spots, that's going to get worse. So you're starting to see like how complicated this is and why I was missing mold. Ear ringing is a big one. Sinus congestion, runny nose, postnasal drip, hay fever. If we keep working down, it can cause thyroid issues depending on which mold you're exposed to. Some interrupt thyroid function. We can see lung symptoms. We can see digestive issues, like a person with a totally messed up gut. And you're like, we're doing all the right things. We added fermented food and all of the neurological stuff just blew up. That's a mold patient. Because there's a classic kind of fermentation sending the message to that microbiome that fungus is trying to move in and reinforcing that message. And I learned that from my patients, because of course I'm like, oh, it's a microbiome disruption. You need fermented food. And then everybody got sicker. I'm like, and now their ear ringing is through the roof. So the gut can be really tricky. The mycotoxins are neurotoxic. So they interrupt the peristalsis, so the gut, squeezing down the tube, which can set someone up for SIBO. And so it's very common to have a long-term SIBO once you've had a mold exposure. Hormone disruption, pelvic pain, irritable bladder, interstitial cystitis kind of look, because again, your microbiome is disrupted on all of the mucosal surfaces, including the bladder, which, just like the sinuses, can allow for more pathogenic species to occur in the bladder. So we see a lot of urinary frequency and bladder problems. And I would say the most common symptom that I see, other than fatigue, is anxiousness. There's just a sense of unsettled. And I'm careful not to call it anxiety, because people have an idea that that's like panic attack. And while that can happen, it's really just something you don't feel settled. And so, of course, that's because your brilliant brain is smelling these mycotoxins. It's sending a message to the brain, in our survival part of our brain, saying, we're not safe, like, get out. And the thinking part of the brain starts looking around and like, I don't see the tiger. I don't see it. I don't hear it. I don't smell it. I'm not tasting anything. We're fine. And so there's this conflict between those two parts of the brain that just creates this sense of unsettled that can happen. And that's like probably the most common thing that I see with my patients is I don't know that I've ever seen a mold sick patient that doesn't have some level of anxiousness or unsettled feeling.
This episode of the Nourishing You podcast is brought to you by Energy Bits. Energy Bits emerged from Catherine Arnsten's vision for convenient, efficient, and nourishing whole food solutions. Founded with the aim of simplifying nutrition, Energy Bits offers algae tablets packed with essential nutrients and proteins. These concentrated bits of food provide a hassle-free way to fuel your body, ensuring optimal nourishment in a convenient form.
Wow.
It's a lot.
It could be so many things. Yeah. Well, so your questionnaire is a great place to start.
Mm-hmm. That's the whole idea. And I made it for myself because I was having a hard time delineating. I had these chronic Lyme patients can have very complex pictures. And I was trying to figure out, well, what if these are mold so we can just get going, on the treatment. And so I created it for myself, but I'm so happy to share it and have people use it and give us feedback. And if anyone's interested in participating in the study, it's crowdsourced. So you can go to the moldiq.org. That's where we're collecting data. And then we got IRB approval, which means we can publish in medical journals, and we'll publish all of our results so it can help people.
God, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I was over the moon about that.
I bet. So, one thing I hear, I think it gets confused, or maybe there's crossover, but you could probably clear this up for us. Are there issues similar that can happen with foodborne mold or like aspergillus type of exposure? Is that the same as what you'd see with building related exposure? Or how are those the same or different?
So in a westernized diet, we do have some mycotoxin exposure, but it's managed, it's tested for, and it's managed in most things. So there are ongoing studies all the time. There was a recent review article where they looked at, I don't know how many, like 1,000 studies that they did. And they were looking at the most commonly reported mycotoxins in the mold and what foods those tended to come from. And this stuff is getting reported all the time. I actually have there's one way we can test this is in the urine. We can test mycotoxins in the urine. But we know that if you're eating or drinking, like coffee, things with mycotoxins, you're going to excrete them through your urine, and hopefully very well if you're a good excreter. If you're a bad excreter, we need to help your body do that. So if we're going to be testing this as a good test, we need to take people off the most commonly contaminated foods for 3 days. There's a 48-hour washout period for most mycotoxins. So if you just go off of those foods for 3 days and then test the urine, we've taken away one of the weaknesses of that test, the potential weaknesses. So yes, we can get some through diet, but in a typical westernized diet, even if someone is drinking moldy coffee every day, I'm not seeing them get to the extent of a mold-related illness patient from a water damage building. We take it, there have been animal studies that show that inhalational exposure of these toxins, not just the mycotoxins, but the mold farts, the aldehydes and things like that. Inhalational is the most efficient way to take it in.
Okay. So they may still be having like a reaction to that aspergillus, but it may be more from like an allergy standpoint than so much of a, like what we're talking about with building exposure.
Well, I kind of see mold allergy that gets my alarms up. We
Okay.
should be able to live. We shouldn't be able to live in a moldy house. That's not a safe place for anybody. But if somebody, it's like, when the leaves start to fall and then you get those rains and stuff, we get more aspergillus outside. So there are seasons, like the shoulder seasons, they call them, the spring and the fall. That's going to be the kind of time in a 4-season place where you're going to see more outdoor molds. And we should all be able to just deal with that. And if somebody's having really wicked responses, allergic responses to that, to the point where they have uncontrolled asthma or, those kinds of things. And I'm like, what's your indoor space like? Because it will tax the immune system and, again, fill their cup. So someone who's like, oh, I have a terrible mold allergy. I'm like, why? Let's take a look at your exposures. And it could be because, could have even been an exposure 20 years prior. Like I have the classic story in my book about like someone who got sick in college. And it was 20 years prior and he's still sick. And it's because he became the moldy building. And so he's been just hosting this, pathological biome all these years. And, we can limp along pretty well because we don't have to deal with the elements. In the winter, we can turn up the heat. In the summer, we can put the AC on and we have good nutrition. We have some things that make us be able to, unfortunately, stay well enough, vertical illness, not horizontal illness. And, people are really struggling, but these toxins, the mycotoxins are carcinogenic. They can cause birth defects. So that's why I'm out here just like, it's a bigger deal, like never settle for, I feel good enough to get, to work and then I crash. Something needs to be investigated there.
Yeah. So at what point with symptoms would an individual start thinking about this and looking into it further? And where would they even go to start checking into it? Would their primary care physician be able to help them? Or what doors do they need to start opening to dig into that?
It's tough because we're not taught about mold in medical school. And so, a regular EENT or allergist, even they are still thinking of mold as a spore problem. And that's why I'm on this mission. Like, we need to expand this. This is an allergy problem and a toxin problem. So where do they start? They start with, I start with the questionnaire. And why would someone even go there? If you have done all the reasonable things, and you've done the diet change and you're doing the exercise and you can't even tolerate the exercise, or you end up, with massive lactic acid afterwards, sore for 3 days for something that is like, why is that? It's not just deconditioning. You're doing sleep hygiene, you're doing the meditative practice. I loved your podcast with my friend, Dr. Diane Mueller. It was so great. Meditate another way, any way that you can find. So you're doing all of the things that make sense and you're not getting the results that make sense. So if you're still hitting these ceilings of recovery, that is a time to go looking at environment. Yeah.
And then I'm just curious, how long after an exposure would somebody tend to see symptoms? Is there any correlation there?
Kind of all over the map because that genetic susceptibility and how sick is the building. I would say in an average, like sneaky mold situation, it can take 3 months before enough things fall apart that you're now on like the next system, the next symptom. So if your symptom has gone to another system, so let's say you start with a little bit of sinusitis, okay, a little postnatal drip, whatever. Maybe I've grown into allergies. Like that's always the thing when somebody's like, oh yeah, I got the 30-year-old allergies. I was like, That's not a thing. Like, wait a minute. We've just so normalized some of these things, that allergists will say, oh yeah, that's the 40-year-old, blah, blah, blah. That's the 30-year-old allergies. I'm like, there's no such thing as 30-year-old. So something shifted, we have to pay attention to that. And now I completely lost track of your question because I got.
No, that's okay. I think you got it. I guess what I just keep like playing in the back of my mind is I keep, thinking of these stories where people's homes have been flooded. We've had so many massive storms and massive situations where, whole cities and towns have been flooded. And I think, oh my gosh, so are these people just letting everything dry out and maybe hoping that fans on it are going to fix it? And do we have like whole towns of people sick now? Like what are we seeing from that? Is that?
Yes. My other dear friend, Dr. Jill Carnahan, she's in Boulder and she talks about Boulder.
I lived through the Boulder flood a decade ago.
Yeah. And what did people do? Did they remove material? I mean, what you're supposed to do, mold can grow within 24 to 48 hours. And so if there is a flood, the idea is before you need to call in the men in white suits because mold grew. So before the mold grows, get in and cut out everything that's wet. Because if you have insulation this thick and you have drywall, which is gypsum, and there's paper on that backside too of that drywall, that is not going to dry out by putting a fan on this side of the wall. So you need to cut that open and get all the wet material out and then dry out anything that's left in there. But, that there's going to be humidity that built up in that wall. So, when we see, I'm always so excited when I get I get a message from somebody that says, I read your book. We're all about mold now. Our water heater, flooded or whatever. And we immediately called our guy and he came and he cut everything out and we're just letting it dry out. How long do we have to let it dry out? Is the big question. And I'm just like, yes, that's the way, that's how you stay well, because you cannot dry out from a fan trying to get through inches of material. That's just not going to work. And it does grow mold. And that can stay wet like a sponge for years behind that drywall because it can't breathe. So yeah, I think that there are, I start pitter-pattering in my heart when I hear hurricanes, and I think actually hurricane areas, they do this better. I think it's the weird 100-year flood, like, in the mountains, how it can just like boom. Yeah. And no one's used to it. And we don't really have the construction people who know how to do the tear outs and that kind of thing. That is where it can get more problematic. Occasional, like Hurricane Sandy, that just went up the East Coast, like that, those occasional storms that are really huge. That's what Michael Rubino, he talks about. He's a remediator. He's like, Sandy is the place where my eyes were opened because, there were all of these people who had water intrusion and it was just seen as sort of like a blight. Like, you just paint over it, you just throw some bleach on it. And what we're finding in the studies that I did in my own house, when you try to treat it with anything wet, you've just watered it, no matter what you put on. Bleach, MSR, which is called mold stain remover. It's only removing a stain. It's not killing the mold. When we retested boards after they treated in my house, because I was like, oh, it's my house. Let's play. Let's do some experimenting. And we found that once they treated it, it grew more mold and more toxic species. So you've got to cut it out. Yeah. And I think we do potentially, some of these, like I said, the big floods that are more episodic, I think are more problematic.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So
we just freaked everybody out.
We got to get ourselves out of this now. So we're all
it's treatable.
Freaked out about it.
No, let's spread some sunshine now.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe you could walk us through the general process of working through an exposure. You've got symptoms. You talked about, maybe taking the quiz, but after that, and you say, okay, yeah, I think this is me. I think I'm having issues from exposure. Mm-hmm. What are some of the steps that people would take with a practitioner like that's trained, like, someone similar to yourself? Like, what are the steps? What does it look like so that we can kind of get a feel for how do I get out of this once I'm in there?
Yeah. So I want to make sure everyone knows that I do train doctors in this method. So there is a way to find them. You can go to my website at the bottom. It's Find a Doctor. And there are mold literate certified doctors who've taken my 10-hour intensive course. So when you're saying like, what does someone do if they do think it's mold, they've taken the questionnaire, they got kind of an E score, then they can contact one of these doctors and they'll work them through the process. But what I realized when I sat down to write my book was the reason for writing the book was that I realized that this is not rocket science. That's the good news. And all of these tools are available to everybody. You go to your health food store, you can get these things. It's just real, like it's very accessible medicine. And I think that's important for everyone to know. I cannot tell you how many emails that I love getting. I love getting these that we found it was mold. We got your book, we worked through the tools and we're better. Thank you. And so I hear that all the time. So I just want to reassure for everybody, even if you can't find that specialist or if you're too financially strapped, there are ways that you can get started on it to make a lot of progress. And when I sat down to write the book, I realized it's kind of like I have a little process. You don't know that until you kind of have to write it down. And I use the visual of peeling an orange. And the reason for the orange is that there are 5 kind of methods or steps that I take. The first 2, though, have to be done as much 100% as possible. Just like if you were going to eat an orange, you would peel off the orange layer. There'd be that white fluffy layer of bioflavonoids. Actually, we should all be eating those. And then you get to the sections and you pick and choose the things that fit the picture of the person. So some people are going to have a lot of heart issues like myocarditis. Well, they're going to need more CoQ10. Some people are going to be having a lot of allergies. Well, they probably would do better with a little quercetin. So as you go through the steps, I have these different tools within each of those 5 steps that you can read what it's good for and be like, okay, that's my symptom, but my husband's is this, And so you can kind of grab the thing and then get started and try it. These things have very low risk to try. And the 5 steps are avoidance. That's number 1. Then that has to be done 100%. You don't get better if you're still exposed to mold. That's the hardest thing.
That's the scariest part, right? Like
exactly.
That's what scares people the most. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean you don't get started on treatment. I have a course called 9 Things to Know While You're Still in Mold, because there's so many people who are stuck in leases. They're stuck in an occupational exposure, and they're told by their doctor, well, I can't treat you until you're out. That doesn't make any sense to me, because we know from animal studies there are things that are protective. If anyone needs a doctor, it's the person stuck in mold. They need it the most, because if someone can get out of mold, 50% of people are just better, just from the avoidance step, and then you're done. The second step is fundamentals. The third is to protect tissues that have been affected, repairing things like the immune system so the body can kick it out. And the 5th is fight. And that's the idea of fight is to reset the microbiomes of the body. And so the avoidance, fundamentals, protect, repair, and fight, each of those steps has a chunk of things that are really healing for the body. And then if those don't work, like the fight, like I told you, I do the nose and the gut, because those are the 2 biggest reservoirs of colonization of the fungus. And then if you're doing all of those things and you are for sure out of mold, that's when you could look up a doctor, but I just want people to feel like I'd rather everyone work at the doctor, because it shortens your decision time and, it shortens the healing path. You don't have to be doing all this experimenting, but if you can't do that, there are other ways to get at it.
Well, yeah, listening to you talk about the healing path, I feel better already, less terrified. So
Yeah,
that's really good.
Yeah.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, and it's a fun one. It's a favorite of our listeners, because we get to learn a little bit more about you. But this has been such an eye-opening conversation. And to the listener, please share this with anybody that you think it can help. And Dr. Christa has an incredible website with all these resources that we've talked about. So anyway, everything that you've been through, with your own home, etc., what do you do personally to stay so vibrant after that journey that you've been through?
Well, thankfully, that journey was a long time ago.
but you had mentioned even some people with exposure 20 years ago can still,
Yeah.
And look at you. You look amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. No, I think for me, and what got me through it was that I get outside every day, no matter what. If it's 11 below, it's short, frequent bouts. If it's really hot and sweaty, it's short, frequent bouts. But I think getting outside, connecting with nature, appreciation of nature, it's not just the being outside. It's the way you be when you're outside, that deep appreciation, that moment of awe, just looking around. Like, my favorite thing is to get up really early in the morning, just as the sun is peeking up and there's been a frost. And it's like the whole world is glitter. It's wonderful, and I'll just stand there sometimes and like sway back and forth so I can see it just like dance and glitter. And, like, be a kid and get outside. That's my thing.
I agree.
Love
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And again, like, it's something simple, right?
Yeah, and free.
Free.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. You've been so generous with us today. We really appreciate the knowledge that you've shared and what you're bringing to people around the world. Like, we need to know, we need to protect ourselves, we need to care and not get lazy about it. I think that's the hardest thing, is just not, seeing it and not just saying, oh yeah, there's a warp in that board. It'll be okay. And just forgetting it. We need to own up. We need to be responsible and take care of ourselves and our health and take care of the place that we live. So anyway, so much great information. I also want our listeners to know that Dr. Christa is at drcrista.com if you're looking to find her and all those great resources that we mentioned today.
Yeah, and I just wanted to circle back to something that you said, which is, I think, so important in this case, but so many cases when we're talking about our health, is you said, one of the most important things I want people to leave with today is trust your inner self.
Yeah.
Trust that inner voice. So
Yeah.
this is a really important situation which to do that.
Yeah, especially, as women, we can get talked down off the intuition by, it's typically guys that are in the construction world. That's just the way it is. And because we have that respect for them and their expertise, it's just, they're just not trained in this yet. So once we get everybody educated and trained, then they'll become your best advocate. But if you don't have somebody that's advocating for you, just understand that that's not in their training. They're trying to do the best thing for you too. And they just want you to not have to have it be that way. And you're like, I don't want it that way either. But, trusting yourself. And where I found my inner voice was getting outside, getting out of the moldy environment, getting off the frequency of mold, then it couldn't talk to me in my inner thoughts. I could be outside and I could chat with nature and then come inside and be like, you know what? No, I don't feel good in this, in this space. And so let's rip out the floor. But yeah, and let's test it. And I found out, wow, there's desert mold in my kitchen. Okay. Yeah.
Who knew?
Who knew?
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you again so much. We really, really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for listening. Until next time, take care.
This episode of the Nourishing You podcast is brought to you by Energy Bits. Energy Bits emerged from Catherine Arnsten's vision for convenient, efficient, and nourishing whole food solutions. Founded with the aim of simplifying nutrition, Energy Bits offers algae tablets packed with essential nutrients and proteins. These concentrated bits of food provide a hassle-free way to fuel your body, ensuring optimal nourishment in a convenient form. For more information or to place an order, go to energybits.com.